Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dome9 webinar. We're going to give a few more minutes for people to join, so please stand by. We'll be back to you in 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dome9 webinar, Achieve Automated AWS Compliance and Governance with Dome9. My name is Thelen Blum. I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Dome9, and I'm here with Patrick Pusher, Dome9's Technical Evangelist. In today's webinar, Patrick is going to discuss how the Dome9 Compliance Engine provides automation combined with continuous monitoring and enforcement, allowing businesses to assess their compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, fix issues such as overly permissive security group rules and weak password policies, enforce requirements, and prove compliance in audits. Administrators have the ability to create and enforce custom rules that describe unique restrictions and governance practices in their organization. Additionally, the Dome9 Cloud Supervisor, as part of the compliance engine, enables you to schedule assessments for your cloud environment with automated actions to remediate and intended to run automatically within the AWS Lambda execution environment. We will close with Q&A at the end of the session. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the questions window of GoToWebinar, and Patrick will address as many questions as possible, time permitting. We also have a couple of Dome9 product briefs that you can download at your leisure. There's the Dome9 Compliance Engine product brief as well as the Dome9 ARC overview product brief. Without further ado, I will now pass the ball to Patrick. Let's get started.
Great, thank you, Thelen, and thanks everyone for joining us. For about the next 40 minutes, our agenda is really to talk a little bit about the different perspectives on data security compliance. That word compliance can be quite charged, and I think the meaning differs in different with different perspectives and different environments. Then we'll maybe shift our discussion a little bit to governance. How that differs from compliance and what we need to consider when we think about how we govern our ultra dynamic infrastructure as a service environments. We'll talk a little bit about compliance and governance trends, sort of from a Dome9 perspective, what we see in the industry, and then I'll introduce to you the Dome9 automated compliance and governance capabilities, and we'll do a little product demonstration as well, including Cloud Supervisor, I think, as Thelen introduced. So, as promised, when we talk about compliance, I think this really can mean different things to different people depending on your context. So level setting on exactly what we mean, I think, is helpful. We really see sort of 3 different compliance use cases, right? On the left-hand side, sort of these general regulations. They are not industry specific. The most common one by far is the payment card industry PCI-DSS data security standard. there is not a particular vertical. If you run a business at all that takes a payment card, handles that payment card, especially the personal information around payment cards, then that's a regulation that you follow. That's a little bit different than sectoral laws, where just by virtue of being a financial services company in New York, for example, you have specific regulation you have to follow. That's different than other industries which may be regulated differently or not at all. That sort of sectoral law perspective is most broadly found in North America and Asia, actually mostly US and Asia. Canada is a little bit more European, sort of in the lots of regulation, maybe not quite as much prescriptive law. And then on the right-hand side, on the no regulation side, this is probably the area or the interest in compliance that we have seen surge the most. And I think it's because, obviously the other two sort of use cases are established. People understand when you're regulated, you have a standard that you follow. It's a must, not a wish. In this case, though, it's more about stakeholders wanting to prove to other stakeholders, to customers, that security is taken seriously, right? So they're adopting by themselves and voluntarily, frameworks by which they can measure their efforts and then report that to their customers or stakeholders. So it's becoming this way in light of the breach activity we've seen last year and this year. It's a way for organizations to sort of attest, they're trustworthy. Dome9 regularly every year participates in a cloud security survey, and this is data from last year, and you can see that the largest, by a fair margin, the quickest rising barrier to cloud adoption was this concern around legal and regulatory compliance. And the reasons why, I think, are mixed. We'll talk about that shortly. Why this compliance, this pursuit of compliance in an infrastructure as a service environment is so different than what we're used to with on-prem infrastructure. So then, we talk a little bit about compliance. When we talk about governance, what does that mean, and how does it, differ from compliance? It's similar, but governance is larger and more comprehensive. It encompasses concepts like policy and risk. It's about putting in place a multidisciplinary framework whereby an organization can scale their IT efforts with the confidence that the policy is never compromised. Governance includes policy libraries and education, IT asset repositories, which is a challenge unto itself when assets are moving and shifting and being provisioned, not by people at consoles, but by other business activity, driving that by API at your cloud provider. We do exception management. We do a lot more as part of governance. So it's like compliance with a much sort of bigger framework and expectation around making sure that our policies are always observed. Many times there is a loss that happens in translation from business requirement to the tooling used to monitor infrastructure, right? And if you're familiar with that age-old telephone game, you already understand this. When a message gets passed on from party to party, as is the case with that game of telephone, and is the case too when policymakers must then work with developers or infrastructure professionals to put policy into action, that message winds up being non-trivially different than it was when it originated. If I'm a policymaker and I tell a developer to go, create this policy, they're going to hear something different than how than the intention of that policy, and that's the minutia, the detail that quite often gets lost. And in that detail, sometimes the policy, the measurements don't hit the mark of the policy. So that's a real challenge, and coming up with a way to do this whereby the policymaker can themselves create the rule without having a technical skill set, was some of the inspiration behind what I'm about to show you. understanding your asset inventory, as I alluded to earlier, in infrastructure as a service environments means understanding context as well. And with usage of features such as auto-scaling, asset inventories can change drastically over time. And this fact really does obsolete the spreadsheet-based governance approach that we've experienced in the past, that we've leaned on in the past. Um, you know, Lastly, finding problems is probably rather obviously the first line of business. But once you find those, what do you do with them? And is IT in your environment and therefore problem resolution centralized, or do business units operate a little bit differently? As that stakeholder list grows, so too do perspectives and expectations. So, how about approach where a proactive, and not to mention a already previously agreed upon, solution to a problem is identified and carried out automatically when certain conditions are met? And even on top of that, and then how about the ability to ensure that the security control in question can never change in the same way again? So sort of fixing it, but then also making sure it stays fixed in the future, kind of fixing the symptom and not, or fixing the cause and not just the symptom. Those are the tenets, that's the vision that Dome9 has sort of been built from day one. And that's our perspective, is when things are complex, automation is your friend. The human touch in the face of complexity isn't your friend, because we make mistakes, and we have other concerns on our plate. So when it comes to judging, taking that report, looking at what's deviated from our desired state, going out and affecting that change in a timely and ongoing manner becomes a challenge, to hit the mark 100%. And so when we automate that, it just, it takes that human element out. If we do it right, we get all the confirmation we need that that's done, and the trust in our policy overall really goes up as a result. So, but we're running a little bit before we walk here, so let's quickly take just a little bit more time on why this is such a challenge in infrastructure as a service environments. Even before the first piece of this slide, deployment, we have a design phase where there is some complexity. But if we take this slide kind of at face value, when we think about infrastructure as a service environments, and especially when we think about multi-cloud environments, which are becoming a much bigger reality than even 3 years ago, I would say. There's lots of talk around hybrid cloud. This notion of cloud to data center connection and interoperability, and maybe even kind of workload movement. That vision really never happened. And I think why it never happened is that the public cloud gave us the capability we needed. But the vision or not rather the vision, but what did wind up happening is that we standardized on one cloud provider, maybe AWS at the start, because they had far more capability than anybody else. And then we found some use cases that maybe fit other cloud providers just as well, or maybe we decided that our disaster recovery efforts would be best served in a completely different cloud provider than the one we use kind of deliver our production applications. Whatever the reason, the multi-cloud scenario is growing. And so when you think about deployment, now we think about deployment, or how we model one policy that works across more than one provider given all of the capability differences. That becomes challenging. And we wind up writing kind of one policy for one provider, and we try to do our best interpreting that over to Azure or over to Google Cloud Platform, but now we have these 3 and growing sets of policies to maintain. When we change 1, we change 3. It doesn't scale well. Not to mention it introduces, again, lots of opportunity for mistake. So having one kind of umbrella way to represent all of your preferences, all of the governance policy that you're interested in, and then kind of affecting that across all the platforms you use is very powerful. But this slide really talks about the challenge of dynamic infrastructure, dynamic use cases, competition from business unit to business unit in how they consume, how they manage infrastructure. In terms of operations, having too many cooks in the kitchen, having too many credentialed accounts. We talk not nearly enough around how we've shifted from multiple resources in our data center, our filer, our hypervisor, our any number of other services, to one set of credentials on the public cloud side that have far, if they're powerful enough, right, far-reaching capabilities across all of those pillars, right? Because AWS provides us all of those services as a service, protected by, credentials. And so that is a scary thing. And as you have more and more operators or admins, you have more and more credentials, and so you have more and more potential for credential compromise. So the need to govern this tighter and tighter, and to increase visibility, isn't just because we lose the touchy-feeliness of the proprietary data center. It's because we're leaning on AWS or Azure or Google Cloud platform in a much more comprehensive way than we ever leaned on a single technology stack in our proprietary data center. And that means, unfortunately, those with bad intent know that as well, and it becomes a real ripe sort of target for compromise. And so our diligence goes up for sure. So when we take a step back and we say, what's happened with compliance and governance over, let's say, the last 5 or 10 years? And what we've really noticed is a move away from this perspective that compliance is a necessary evil to one where, and maybe this is because the standards have gotten a little bit better over time, to one where we're considering this as kind of complementary to the other security efforts we're doing. We're finding value in it, and therefore we're really striving to put more than just checkboxes behind the requirements. We're trying to get the most out of the data security standard, and we see that. We see organizations spending a lot more money than they have to get a certification to be as secure as they can, and that's a really, really positive change. There was this kind of cynicism around compliance not long ago that we've seen sort of change really positively over time. The one thing that's sort of interesting and that hasn't gone away is we still see this, this compliance standard that isn't as prescriptive maybe as some of us would like, especially security practitioners. There is a lot of room for interpretation, right? And that ranges. There are some, like the Center for Internet Security, that are very prescriptive. There are others that sort of define high-level requirements, and they let you interpret that and implement those controls and those measures, which is good, except on the measurement side, when we're talking strictly sort of legal and regulatory, that becomes a challenge, right? There's so much room for sort of subjectivity versus objectivity in a more prescriptive rule that does become a bit of a challenge, and frankly, it becomes a challenge for organizations like us who are trying to help, right? We're trying to read the standard, interpret the standard, write the rules, and when that is so very variable, that becomes a little bit tough. Some assumptions have to be made. So that still occurs. We do see some that take that prescriptive approach, I think, for some of those reasons, and for those, I think, for everybody involved, it's a simpler standard to understand and to execute in your environment. We talked about the interest in custom rules and organization-specific checks. I think that's kind of falls in line with that third category of compliance that we thought of earlier. This need to provide assurance to the rest of the organization that security is being considered as a central kind of pillar in IT, I think is probably the main force in driving that observation. Third-party ecosystem around compliance tooling is maturing. It's one of the reasons we put the resource emphasis on building this feature last year. We saw the current stable of compliance tools and thought that we could do a much better job, do that in a much more efficient means, and that was really the design intent of the compliance engine, which we'll look at very shortly. And then lastly, the typical Dome9 customer has shifted over the years from more of a startup kind of developer-centric, because that was also the cloud customer. But as more enterprise adoption happened, and as Dome9 sort of listened to that enterprise customer more and more and built out the platform that you see today, the typical Dome9 customer has become one that has or plans to have very shortly a significant investment in either AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud Platform. And that significant investment usually means their infrastructure will be at a scale whereby understanding something immediately by looking at it won't be possible. And it's really that kind of scale that has given us that perspective around how difficult managing that infrastructure is, at that scale. And not only at that scale, but when your application becomes mature and sort of greenfield enough, if you will, to be able to control the scale of your infrastructure itself. Auto scaling is one thing. You see a lot of requests come in, AWS turns around and spins up machines, but what if your application itself can do that? Your application could understand application-centric measurements, then make API calls to the control plane of AWS saying, I need more machines, or I need less machines, or I need additional services. It's that kind of complexity and scale that we find the enterprise customer has the most challenge in. And so wrapping automation around this measurement, and even further around the response to the deviations you find, that might be a nice to have in a smaller, less sort of scaled out environment. It becomes a necessity to the kind of customer that we found over the years really finds value in Dome9. So that's where we've gone, and that's where we'll spend most of the rest of the webinar here today. So in response to really everything we've talked about so far, last year at Dome9, this has been in the process for a long time, but last year around September, we debuted the Dome9 compliance engine. And the compliance engine takes all of the data. We haven't talked about this kind of specifically, but you bring all of your cloud accounts to Dome9. So if you've got 10 AWS accounts, 2 Azure accounts, and 5 Google Cloud Platform accounts, you plug those all into Dome9. And Dome9 aggregates that data into its data model and then allows you to do all sorts of things. Today we're talking about compliance and governance. So it lets you set your rule set out and measure across all of that infrastructure that you manage with Dome9. So you're identifying the gaps between what your infrastructure looks like at any given time versus what that model you represent in the way of rules, compliance rules within Dome9. And the compliance engine is a feature unto itself, but there are several features within Dome9 that kind of plug into this picture, right? We use the compliance engine to identify. We use potentially a cloud supervisor to automatically remediate. And then we have other features that once you fix a problem, and I think I alluded to this earlier, you can sort of turn on to make sure that problem stays fixed. Tamper protection is one that you see sort of on the screen in the middle box there, that if we have time we'll talk about. But it's a follow-on feature that speaks to compliance, not as directly as the compliance engine feature as it's named, as you'd expect does, but it's part of that story. We talk about the ability to remediate either by hand. Dome9 has lots of capabilities to remediate kind of on top of the capabilities you'll find at the respective cloud consoles. Things like cloning security groups, manipulating the how new security groups get judged kind of as an onboard policy, all sorts of things like that, fixing in place. But today we're not going to talk so much about the interactive way to fix things. We're going to talk about how to connect to the compliance engine assessment, a way to automatically remediate some of the conditions found that that deviate from our desired standard. And then lastly, being able to prove this, taking a run of a compliance engine, saving that, coming back, looking at your compliance journey over time, for example, having an auditor come in and see how your compliance efforts have sort of changed leading up to this audit event, for example. All sorts of capabilities like that built into the feature. So just before we look a little deeper at the ins and outs of the feature, let's just talk fundamentally a little more about Dome9. We talked about, we kind of level set on the ability to add as many cloud accounts as you have. When you do that, it may or not be apparent. What you're doing is that you're connecting Dome9 to the API of that respective cloud provider. In the case of AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. You are not loading data into your environment. You're not loading agents, or you're not loading appliances to filter traffic. We are connecting to the API of your cloud provider. And so, we are understanding the environment. If you're using Dome9 in a read-write way, we are affecting control via that API. But what that means is, when you start, you are immediately, within 5 minutes, you can be effective using Dome9. Whether it's the compliance engine or any other feature that we have in the platform, your return on investment in terms of getting started and getting effective and saving time, is unprecedented for sure. It also means that we don't see your data. We are interested in the state of your security controls and making sure that you always know that state, and if it deviates, you know why, and you're in control. That's the intent of the Dome9 platform. We do this for network security. We also do this for identity and access management on AWS. Remediate in place. We talked a little bit about this already. Find it, fix it, stay fixed. Enough broad capability in Dome9 to be able to find problems, understand them, fix them either interactively or as we're going to talk about now, in place kind of automatically, if you will. But then also make sure that that never happens again, right? By adding an additional layer of security on top of what you get from your native infrastructure as a service provider. Talk a little bit too about how the compliance engine can be your partner in proving your compliance journey over time with this notion of save reports and assessment history and even the compliance dashboard. I'll show you that very shortly. Okay, so what we're now going to talk about is specifically the compliance engine and how it works. What I'm about to show you is either sort of off the shelf or sort of roll your own policy, the ability to say, I want to measure my infrastructure against this baseline. And the way you describe that baseline within Dome9 is using a language that we've developed called Governance Specification Language, or GSL. And GSL is a very natural language intended to empower a compliance professional to write a rule themselves, a policymaker to write a rule themselves without having to pass that on to somebody with a developer skill set. All of that power is really kind of embodied in this GSL, this governance specification language. It's also embodied in what we have, a feature we have called the rule builder, where if you're new to the language, if you don't understand it, there's sort of a guided process to be able to build these rules whereby you will then measure your infrastructure against. Why we built this GSL approach really has to do again with simplicity. This is an example of a rule. Security groups should have inbound rules with port 22 and scope 0000. Now, this is actually an incorrect rule. It really should say should not have. I'm not sure of anybody who wants a wide open scope on TCP port 22, which is a very sensitive kind of administrative protocol, SSH, open to the world. That's probably not a desired state, but that is a rule that you can write with GSL. It's that simple. It's not a description, that's the rule itself. How about this one? Incident should have name and tags with key equals owner. That's something that if you had to write code for, would take you, tens of lines of code. Here we have one almost English sentence that, if you don't know the language, maybe you can't write on day one, but you can understand on day one for sure. And getting to the point where you can write is very straightforward. Last one, a very good rule that is likely in many data security standard bundles that are out there, and certainly ones that we have hosted within Dome9. Your default security groups, which are security groups that must exist, should never be used. So they should never have inbound rules. They shouldn't have outbound rules either, but they for sure should never have inbound rules kind of allowing traffic in. A very, very simple rule to attest within Dome9 GSL, not so much the case within other platforms. If we look at some competitive ways of doing this, this is what not even, I think, all of the code looks like to make sure that a CIFS, Common Internet File Sharing Protocol, is not open to the entire world. That's what that looks like in competing situations and scenarios, and that's what it looks like within Dome9. So, a much simpler way, a much more efficient way to attest these things, but also a much more natural context or format to understand, and that's the goal. So, with that said, let's go have a look at the solution. Let's stop talking in theory and let's pivot over to the demo portion here. So welcome to your Dome9 dashboard. This is my personal account, so this doesn't have a whole lot of infrastructure in it. Our normal demo accounts have a little bit more, but I'm actually going to be affecting change here, so I don't want to step on maybe someone else's toes that's working in the environment. So this is my small but dedicated environment that we're looking at. And we're going to spend, these are sort of your main dashboard within Dome9. And if you're familiar with Dome9, I'll say this going in. Our traditional perspective has been really fundamental network security, with managing concepts like security groups, VPCs, network ACLs, those sorts of things. We certainly still do that, but you will find that the compliance engine has a much broader perspective than that, with the goal of being able to be useful for not only port exposure kinds of scenarios, which is really our bread and butter, something we're very, very good at. It's got that capability, but we can measure much, much more. We can measure things like, are you rotating your passwords properly with an IAM? Or do you have MFA turned on account-wide or not? These kinds of things. Are you rotating keys in AWS KMS properly? It's that sort of capability that that this feature has. So you'll see that we have both the ability here to pick off-the-shelf standards, and Dome9 ships with several that are sort of matured over time, and you'll find more, we have some NIST standards we're working on. You'll find more that debut over time as well. But these are off-the-shelf kind of things you can leverage without investing really any effort at all into, how the rules work or the language or anything. Take these either best practice driven or more formally sort of data security, more formal data security standard driven, away you go. And so I'm going to take this PCI report and just show you kind of the breadth of some of the things we measure. Under validation types, you can filter for this, right? If you're truly interested in kind of what we measure against instances versus what we measure against identity and access management versus what we measure against, RDS. Doesn't really matter. That's one way to sort of break down a bundle and understand it better. But if we scroll through this, you'll get a feel for, again, the breadth of services and conditions that the Compliance Engine feature set really can measure. And so we're going to take this one and let's run it. And we'll run it against our AWS account. And again, my AWS account is not very populated. So, this is very quick, but even in the most populated accounts, I think this works against, our local data model. So I think you'll find that the speed is very surprisingly fast, given the amount of data that has to be considered. In this case, there isn't much data that has to be considered, so it is very fast. But this gives you a feel for what the output looks like, right? For every single test, the output is contained herein. And here's one rule that we're actually going to take and roll a little bit with in our own measurement. And this is ensure no security group allows ingress from any basically 0000 to SSH. Kind of a really bad practice for sure. And it looks like I have 9 security groups that fail that. So I can expand this. I can look at those 9. I can click each security group, and here's a security group aptly named bad security group that's got this really, really bad policy associated with SSH. And now I can actually see the problem. And if this security group's in full protection, I can actually leverage edit controls right within Dome9. I do not have to bounce over to the AWS console, for example. So too, once I institute full protection, I'm able to say any change that doesn't originate from Dome9, so if it's at the AWS console, if it's from the first invocation of an automation script against the API, anything, if something tries to change the state of SSH in this security group, Dome9 will shift that back, will actively revert that back. So that full protection is one of these stay fixed controls. We talk about the find it, fix it, keep it fixed. Temporary protection really falls in that keep it fixed category, where we find it, with the compliance engine, we fix it with the controls here, or by going back to the respective console, and then we turn on full protection. And from that point on, that change that did open up this SSH port will never be allowed to stand again. And so that's part of the workflow around understanding the issues via the compliance engine, working through to resolution. So we talked a little bit as well about the assessment history, where you can, it's filterable by time as well, where you can look at previous runs of any compliance bundle, and really dig into not only the high-level result that you can see that in the dashboard view, but you can actually dig into the report itself and look at this previous run. This one is only earlier in today. So that ability to sort of prove over time to to stakeholders anywhere that your security posture has kept improving, I think is very, very important. So too, the best way to sort of digest this report, there's lots of interactivity. If you're multi-region, we'll test each region and then kind of roll up those results as well. So the best way to share this information definitely is with a Dome9 account. But if that's not possible, you can print kind of different views and go ahead and that's kind of a nice compact PDF and share those within your organization as well. Okay, Let's have a look at then the other side of the compliance engine. If we're interested in some of that off-the-shelf, pre-written, pre-spec'd measurements that you find in these bundles, yet we also have some things we want to do that we'll never find in a generalized standard, right? Maybe something that's just a little bit too specific. You can write your own rules, and that's really key. So if I go in down below this kind of shaded line here, I've got my own policy. And how I built this is that I cloned this best practices sample, this 22 rule, and I added another rule. So I went here, I cloned my bundle, and then now this is fully editable. I can go into each rule, I can see the GSL associated with each rule. And here's one that we had similar to our slide deck example. It's maybe a little more comprehensive, where my security group should never have any inbound or outbound rules if it's named default, right? We all know that's the best practice. The Dome9 compliance engine is going to make sure that never ever happens. And if it does, you're going to know about it. And we'll talk about if it does very shortly. What can we do? Either interactively when we learn this, or even before that, kind of pragmatically, just by running the compliance engine and getting this result. What can we do about these things? The rule I added is this one here. And what I did was, this may not be the rule you would really want in the wild, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but this one says an instance that has an inbound rule that contains port 22, which is the default port for SSH, as I think we've talked about in this session already, should not have that inbound rule scope associated with SSH that is any, that's that 0000. The reason this rule you might want to reconsider is that usually we're not only interested in having an any kind of rule, we're also interested in rules with 50 hosts. Maybe we want to make sure that if we're whitelisting somebody for a services sensitive SSH that it's really, really super required and business driven and business justified. We can say make sure the scope is smaller than whatever that number is for you. So there might be a few more conditions that we would add to this rule with some ands or ors or conjoining statements, but this one is really built for simplicity. What's important is this remediation step. We'll talk about this now in terms of building Dome9 rules is probably the first piece I wanted to leave you with, kind of leaving you with that example of how different this approach is than other competing solutions. And so before I leave that, I want to make sure you understand this notion of a rule builder, where if you know the syntax of the language, which again is fairly natural, but to be fair, if you're kind of rolling on day one, you may not understand. We have or if you don't know exactly all of the entities that we support and you don't want to flip back to that language reference tab, move over to the rule builder, and you'll find that this is a guided process to help you build rules and understand the context, not only of what we measure, but how to join statements, how to build conditions, everything. So, if I'm more interested in, okay, for IAM should have, what's that? Oh, when we talked about account MFA enabled. Right? If I didn't know how to write that rule, the process to walk through that sort of as guided by the rule builder is relatively straightforward. And then just to make sure, you won't get a syntactically incorrect rule if you're strictly using kind of the guidance of the builder. But just to test it, you can use kind of the unit test and see that, oh, okay, my account, as an account, this doesn't say that individual users maybe do or don't have MFA turned on, but as an account, I don't have that kind of turned on and mandated. And that's a problem. So that's that's as easy as it is to go from conception of a rule to I'm actually measuring my infrastructure, within seconds. Okay, so let's back up then and talk about the potential. We talk about the workflow where we run a report, we understand what deviates. Even within Dome9, we can do some remediation without bouncing between all those, in air quotes, panes of glass, right, between the console of your cloud provider, maybe a spreadsheet where you're doing inventory, and the Dome9 platform. All you need is a Dome9 platform to really manage that. And we talked about how powerful that is. What we didn't talk about was how this works in heavily automated scenarios, because in heavily automated scenarios or workflows or environments, Dome9 users are not coming and clicking on the Run Assessment button. They are triggering these assessments in a number of ways. So we can talk about what those conditions are. Maybe it's a time interval, maybe it's conditional based on something else happening in their environment. they're triggering the assessment, the run of one or more of these bundles of rules non-interactively by Dome9 API. And even more than that, they're then measuring the outcome of that run and deciding to take selective action on pieces that are important enough to do so. And so when you see this rule, and under remediation, I mean, normally remediation is a text field, and you can put, kind of the steps you would take to remediate a problem like this. But it also has this capability of being able to trigger auto remediation, as kind of the auto asterisk denotation might suggest. And it's the interpretation of what we call Cloud Supervisor that will read these what you've got kind of after this auto designation and take action. And so Cloud Supervisor, way over here, is an open source initiative led and maintained by Dome9. We have several of these. Our API is documented in an open source project. We have script libraries to do tamper protection manipulation with the API and heavily automated scenarios. Lots of different capabilities. The Cloud Supervisor is, again, really about bolting, some remediation capability, some automatic remediation capability to what the compliance engine really does. And there's two ways of using Cloud Supervisor. Probably the most common way, especially in AWS environments, obviously, is to use it in a Lambda serverless function kind of way. And if you're not familiar with Lambda, it's this ability to describe a function almost as a service within AWS, and then to execute that without provisioning, machines and operating systems. We assume that happens in the background. AWS takes care of that, and our functions run, and the output is available to us. So Cloud Supervisor then sort of connects both the compliance engine output with some functionality hosted by Lambda to take action. And if you use it that way, it's probably simpler, but you can certainly spin up, for other environments which aren't AWS, namely, you can spin up or if you prefer to do this, you can spin up a instance or virtual machine, and you can have that sort of be the center of action where you say, quarantine my instances if I find that they have this set of criteria. A Lambda function is probably the most natural and simple way to do that, no doubt. But you can host this Cloud Supervisor infrastructure on a server and use that way as well. Instructions for both are here, but it's worthwhile mentioning that this is a starting point. And what we mean by that is Cloud Supervisor is in response to our customers saying, we're leveraging the compliance engine so much that, and our scale is so large that when we find errors or problems, yeah, if they're a certain kind, we can handle those by hand. But if they're kind of table stakes things that happen commonly, we want a way to address that, right away, or maybe not address it fully, but lower the risk associated with those exposures or those conditions that have been found that violate our policy. And so it is a starting point. You will find that this project, the way to install it into Lambda is very, very straightforward. Basically, you will generate your Dome9 API keys. Those are required. You will need the bundle ID of whatever rule bundle that you're considering for this capability. And you can do multiples, but one call for one bundle at a time. And the bundle IDs are found here within Dome9. So if I'm looking at, let's go back to my example here of the compliance bundle that I built previously, this one here, its ID in the URL is 5124. So you need that as well. Those are your dependencies. Whoops, back here. And your AWS account ID is required if you're running on a third-party machine, as you would expect. It doesn't have that context. Not required if you're running on the Lambda side. Lambda has the ability to understand that as part of the context of running your functions, which is one of the reasons it's really, really powerful. Yeah, Lambda installation steps maybe aren't as thorough as they will be shortly, but there's enough here to understand how to do this, and I'll walk you through it as well. So here are really what I wanted to go for first is the supported actions. So this is a starting point. we've built some actions into Cloud Supervisor. They are the ability to stop an instance. So if an instance is exhibiting a behavior, maybe a network exposure, that's the example we're going to use today, that you don't like, you can stop it. You can tag something, and that's not just an instance. You can tag anything. You can mark something for stop, so that that will stop in the future. Maybe not exactly right now, or you can send an SNS message to an SNS topic within AWS as part of a condition, right? So you find something, you want to send a message through SNS that makes it to your SIM tool that, where you already have some, predefined action that'll happen. You kind of want to create that gateway between, the Dome9 compliance engine output and the input, or at least the interpretation of that in a standard tool set you already have. That's where you'd probably leverage that send SNS kind of capability. We'll add more soon, but we'll also likely over time roll some of these capabilities into the compliance engine kind of feature set within Dome9 proper, right? Outside of a script library, if you will. Things like stop an instance, creating a tag, these may or may not, it's likely over time they will kind of become functions or features that are kind of in the compliance engine proper. But that flexibility will never go away. That flexibility to invocate Lambda functions in response to, first of all, using that Lambda function to trigger the assessment via API at Dome9, reading that data flow back, and then making judgments on what to do. When that what to do becomes complex, and it always does, it always does. We could build in, 20 different things to do, for actions to take, and the day we release, we'll get the call for the 21st, right? Because we have ways of measuring and managing our infrastructure that come from our experience, that come from how we've seen it done in the past, all the education we have that are different, and yeah, to say that system administrators and network administrators and security administrators have their own preferences is a huge understatement, and we'll leave it at that. So the ability to do both of these is key, and so we've built this bundle. We know the ID of the bundle. We use all that information to configure this. And then here is how we deploy that script to Lambda. So although we say we don't have Lambda installation instructions, we actually do. And it tells you how to set up your Lambda function. Basically, you'll download Cloud Supervisor. You'll create a zip file. When you go to create your Lambda function, you will create it from a zip file with the parameters here. It uses Node.js 4.3. The handler has to do with kind of the function labels within the information you're uploading to AWS. So use this one for sure, Lambda to my handler, and then just configure your function this way. There's really nothing you need to do except make sure you supply, as we talked about earlier, your Dome9 API key, your Dome9 secret key, and your Dome9 bundle ID. And then away you go. You need some permission for this, but what we do, and I know we're a little bit over time, so we're going to drive this home quickly. You have a permission for the role that runs this Lambda function, but in the end, what you're going to do, and we'll do this really quickly, I have a running instance. It's called webinar instance, coincidentally, and my Lambda function here. Normally, I'm going to have this either scheduled or maybe as part of a condition. I would run this. Today, I'm just going to run this manually, and I'm going to hit test. It doesn't matter what data I pass. This is kind of the ability to pass data into your function. I'm just going to hit save and test. We don't need any data for ours. It kind of works independently. We've got all the data we need in there. And it runs. And it's going to measure all of my infrastructure. And the rule that really I've set up to fail, if you will, is this one. Because any instance with SSH wide open, and wide open meaning 0.0.0.0 is going to effectively trip this rule up. And what I've told my compliance bundle to do is to stop any instance you find with these conditions. And so if we come back, once we've run this manual invocation, we have the output here. We see that we have 10 failed tests. We have some rule violations, and so we tried to stop a bunch of instances. Now, most of them were already stopped, but this one called webinar instance, which we just looked at, which we just saw was running. And so if we reload this, sometimes my browser does this, it takes a little bit of time, we'll find that instance is in fact stopping because the compliance engine found it, and the Lambda functionality in Cloud Supervisor did what it was told. It took that auto remediation step of stopping the instance. Now, that risk is really reduced significantly. We can go in, we can see what the problem truly is. But thanks to Cloud Supervisor, we don't have to wait until someone at 6 in the morning reads the alert and takes the action. So that's really the intent, I think, of the webinar today, to make sure we left you with the general feel for what the Dome9 compliance engine is all about, but also, how you can connect the open source initiative called Cloud Supervisor to this and get some, some ability to automatically remediate those conditions which really do violate, the policy that either you've taken off the shelf or that you've defined, yourself. We talked a little bit about tamper protection. We're going to skip that. We're just a little bit long in the tooth for our time today. But I do want to let you know that we do a lot more than just sort of compliance and governance. We do tactical day-to-day. We do active security group management. We do conditional firewall exception management with dynamic access leasing. And we regularly do webinars really across all of this. So I really do urge you to tune into dome9.com/webinars or visit our content library online at dome9.com to read the product briefs, much like you have in the handout section there today. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. All right, everyone. Due to time constraints, this is the end and now concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for attending. If you have any further questions on the information presented today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via the email address q&anda@dome9.com. I have a few final notes. If you enjoyed the webinar presented today and would like to experience the Dome9 ARC platform for yourself, we are offering a 14-day free trial. Please visit our website at www.dome9.com and click on the Get Started button on our home page. Just register and a representative from Dome9 will contact you to activate your free trial. Additionally, if you liked the webinar today and would like to hear more about the multi-cloud security solutions Dome9 provides, please visit the resources page on our website and sign up for several of our upcoming webinars. If there's a topic you would like us to discuss, please contact us through our website and let us know. With that, we thank you for your time today and hope you found the content informative. This now concludes the Dome9 webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.